Welcome to the PDX Media good old days, Margie. And you've covered several arms of media, so we can chat about all that. Let's just start with what you're doing now. You're back to the Seattle area? Is that right?
No, I live in Portland.
Oh, good. Okay.
We still live in Portland. And when there's not a quarantine, what I have been doing the last few years is I did radio work for KPAM for about 3 years, 2.5 years, and a lot of theater, which I always wanted to do more of, but I had full-time jobs, and my full-time jobs, as you know, in media usually mean much more than full-time.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I love your theater background because it's been going on for so long. I saw you in Guys and Dolls probably in the early 80s.
Yeah, I think that was around 83, but
Yeah.
it goes back much further than that. I actually did, I grew up in Southern California. Not true, we moved 18 times. We ended up in Southern California. And I did The Sound of Music with Florence Henderson when I was 16.
Nice.
I am 16 going on 17, and I was, and
Yeah.
I got equity cards. So I have been doing this more than 50 years now.
So that's the part of the girl who wants to marry
she's in love with Rolf, who's secretly a Nazi.
Right.
What, you didn't see The Sound of Music, that classic film?
No, I've seen it many times. I just can't keep all the kids straight.
They had too many.
I remember my niece went to Leavenworth every summer to do musical theater, and she was the understudy for what's her name? What's the main part? Come on now.
Maria.
Yeah, I wanted to say Julie Andrews, but no, she was the understudy for Maria. So we went up the one night that she got to perform Maria, and I remember she had to kiss her love interest, and the guy was like 30 years older than she was because she was just a kid. It made her uncle a little uncomfortable.
I think that was actually realistic, Carl.
Probably,
I think
yeah.
Trapp really was that much older than Maria was in the original. But of course, that their great-grandchildren live in Portland, and Pink Martini, I got to perform with them. I played Liesl at 16. I played Maria my senior year of high school. I played Maria again in Seattle. And then at Broadway Rose Theater here in Portland, out in Tigard, I got to play the Mother Superior a few years ago. I told my husband, the only thing left for me is Captain Von Trapp.
And that's a new version of The Sound of Music.
Well, these days, there's all this gender fluidity. Why not?
Yeah. How'd you end up in Seattle then when you started, I think, at King TV, right?
Yeah, I did want to pursue a career at first, I thought, in opera, and studied at the Mozarteum in Salzburg after I graduated from Whitman. But you know what? It was just too peripatetic. I decided, no, living out of a suitcase and not having a real home is not for me. And I was in my early 20s. So I moved to Seattle, where a lot of my college friends were, and I was hired by King Broadcasting. In fact, I was hired by King Radio, King AM, Rockin' Radio 11, which, boy, we could do a whole podcast on experiences with those crazy people. They were so much fun. But that's where I got my start. I was hired as the secretary receptionist because back then there was help wanted male, help wanted female. And there weren't a lot of options for women, but
no kidding.
I was lucky because I got the secretarial post with King Radio, which was in the same building as King TV and King FM, and just honestly worked my way up.
Mm-hmm.
And I started singing commercial jingles in their production office, and then I started my own commercial jingle company, where I would write and arrange and record spec commercial jingles, all my voice, because I didn't want to pay anybody else for the specs, and sold some, and then started getting some national jingle commercials. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I will be a singer after all. But then, hard right turn, got hired for a public affairs show on King Radio, which was simulcast AM FM, which is an interesting combination, rock and roll and classical music. It was the only show they had in common, but they had to do a public affairs show, the FCC said. So
back with the fairness doctrine.
Exactly, and equal time, and we can talk about that. But the guy who hosted the show unfortunately got cancer, and he came to me and said, I think you should try to do this job. And I said, no, 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 because the belief then was no one wants to hear a woman's voice on the radio, right? Do you remember hearing that ever? Because I certainly heard it a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know that it happened.
But I went in, so I went into the boss and I presented a 63-page proposal that I host this little 4-hour public affairs show that aired on Sunday mornings from 6 to 10 a.m.
Well, you were thorough.
Let me tell you, I was ready. And I mean, what could he do? He gave it to me. So that's how I got my start. And then later I worked into TV producing, writing scripts, and filling in for the host of Seattle Today, which was their morning talk show.
And that there was your link to AM Northwest at KATU, right?
That's right. Unfortunately, I decided to leave King because I was having sexual harassment problems. I had a new boss who came to my apartment at midnight and said that if I wouldn't, how shall I say this, be his girlfriend, that he would take me off the air. And at this point, I was doing reporting on the weekends. I was associate producing an evening talk show. I was filling in for the woman host of Seattle Today. I was doing documentaries and appearing on camera. And I said no, and he took me off all of them. And so I had a friend at Como TV in Seattle, which was owned by Fisher, which also owned at that time Channel 2 down here. And she and her husband, Ken, who was working at King, highly recommended me for this spot on AM Northwest. And I came down and talked to the wonderful Chuck Ingold, who was program director at Channel 2 back then. And he hired me. So that was a really fortunate thing for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it turned out great for you and us and your career in Portland, but the process by which you had to go through that kind of sucked.
It really did, because, you know, after I didn't make a big deal of it. I told very few people. But after I had resigned and said I'm leaving for KATU in Portland, I decided, you know, I need to tell King about this guy because he could cause him a lot of trouble. So I went into the personnel woman, that's what they called it then, not human resources. And I said, you know, you need to know this is why I'm leaving, and this guy could cause you a lot of problems. And this woman said, well, right now we're being sued by another woman because of his behavior. And if you testify against him, you will never work in TV again. So, you know, I thought, well, I'm leaving at the right time and I hope for the right place.
Okay, so I'm going to take this time to apologize to you on behalf of my gender.
Oh, no. No, you know why you don't need to do that? Because so many more men have been supportive and have been mentors and have been just terrific people, lifelong friends. I still communicate with Chuck Gingold. He went on to WABC as program director in New York City and then headed the Discovery Channel until he retired. He's just a wonderful man, and he was so supportive. So for every bad apple, there were, you know, more good apples. You don't need to apologize. I love men. I have lots of brothers, and I had the best dad in the world. So no.
Well, I guess I'd like to think that what you went through, and many other women have done, paved the way for a societal change where we're on the way, I guess, to remedying that or fixing it. We know that's not the case. You know, hopefully, if that kind of thing were to happen to a young woman today, she would have avenues that were a little stronger to fix the situation.
Well, she would have those avenues. She does have those avenues because there were no laws back then about sexual harassment. And basically the way we handled it was by telling no one. You know, I told my best friend. That's the only person I told. I didn't even tell my mother. You know, you just accept it and move on. Back then there was some kind of saying about how women have to work twice as hard to get half as much, but thank goodness that's easy to do. You know, it was humor, it was irony, right? But we kind of use that mentality to cope and say, well, I'm not going to let this stop me. I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to find a place where I can do what I want to do and what I hope I do well.
Yeah, one of the joys of talking with some people over this podcast, and even people who haven't done it, but I've talked to them about things like that, is learning how many people have had to struggle through situations like that based on gender or race. You know, for much of my time, I was pretty naive to the fact that some people that I was working with were going through that and being silent because it wasn't going to help them. I'm sad that it took a while for me and for many of us to kind of, you know, get on board and understand what people were going through.
Well, a big part of it, as you say, is because we didn't tell you guys, you know, because we didn't want word to get back to the guy who's doing it, and then we'd lose our job.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, if there had been some way to let the men be aware, I think they would have defended us along with the other women we told. But, you know, and I had experiences at KATU too. And I have to tell you that even now, I made a conscious decision maybe 10 years ago to start talking about this stuff. And two very interesting things happened. One is women I worked with up in Seattle, and not so much in Portland, but up in Seattle, chimed in on Facebook and said, that guy was a jerk. He did that to me too. I can't believe we put up with that. So that was nice, not to be the sole voice out there. But then the other thing that happened is that when I mentioned with no names, things that had happened, and said some of them included things that happened here, well, I only worked at one station here. And suddenly I was unwelcome at the alumni parties. And really, I mean, people would just walk away. And what did I do? I just told the truth about what their bosses did. And in some cases, what they did. But that it's not okay to tell the truth, even 30, 40 years after it happened. It's crazy.
Yeah, we have a long way to, we've tried to head in the right direction, but we certainly have a long way to go. And long after you and I are gone, people are still going to be struggling with those issues.
Yeah.
So let's talk about AM Northwest, because I think that show is a gem of local television. I grew up watching it, grew up watching you and Boz, you know, and I hate to say that because our age differences aren't that much, but when I was at home in high school and wanted to be in TV news, you know, I was watching that in the morning, and I loved I just loved it. And the chance to go host it, you know, maybe 30 years later was something I could not pass up. You guys kind of built that from the ground up, didn't you?
Well, you know, there were three people responsible for the success of that show. One was Chuck Ingold, who conceived of it, the program director I talked about, who went on to New York and greater things. The other was the producer, Lynn Boler, whom I believe was the producer from day one. And the third, of course, was Jim Bosley, who was so charismatic and so likable and came with a following. He did it. It was a half-hour show, and he did it alone for the first year. I believe Kathy Smith did the news cut-ins with him. Kathy is one of the most wonderful people you will ever meet. But anyway.
My first guest on my podcast, by the way.
Yeah, well, that was a good choice. But so then Chuck decided to enlarge it, to take it to an hour and add a studio audience. And so when he interviewed me, he was very interested in the fact that I had done weeks and weeks of fill-in work on the morning show, and also that I was helping produce, one of the producers on a live evening show. So I made it clear, I do not want to just be talent, because women then who were talent, that's what they called people on the air, still do, were kind of considered to be Barbie dolls. And I knew that I could produce a good show. I knew that I understood exactly how to run a show. I didn't want to be the boss. I didn't want to be Jim Bosley's boss on this show. And it had a fantastic producer, and her name was Lynn Boler. And she had come from LA.
I can tell you, my neighbor now here in Central Oregon.
Really?
Yes, I see Lynn all the time.
Well, give her my love.
I will.
And tell her, and I've said this, I've written this, I've said this many times, best producer I ever worked with. And with my apologies to the other really good producers I worked with. But Lynn and Jim had put together a fun show, and I came in and I said, okay, here's what you do, yeah. And I stole everything from the Seattle show and added some of my own things that I had added to our evening show in Seattle. And, you know, things like put the main guest on first so people will tune in right away at the beginning of the show because they know the big star will come on. And I just offered tidbits like that. But they already had a great show. It would have been a great show without me. I was just lucky to come in at the right time. But Bosley was not happy. And a couple interesting things happened. Chuck Ingold said, I'm going to hire you and bring you down here just to observe for a few months, and then we'll gradually put you on the air. And I thought, well, okay, you do what you want. And so I came down and I started, and I kid you not, I was just observing my very first day. That night, Jim Bosley had a major heart attack. And I will never forget, I got the phone call in my brand new Portland apartment, and Chuck said, well, we're going to feed you. I love this mixed metaphor. We're going to feed you to the lions and see if you sink or swim. You're going to do the show alone. Well, I'd never done a show alone on the air. I'd always had a co-host with the shows that I'd done. And so I went in, and we were pre-taping a 4th of July show, and the coffee table in front of me was filled with fireworks. And I was so nervous. I was supposed to start out by saying, it's Tuesday, July 4th or something like that. And I went, it's Tuesday, July. It was the 4th of July show.
Yeah, one out of 31 chance of getting it right.
I know. Hello. Look at all these fireworks. But anyway, of course, I was nervous doing it alone. But, it was fun. And I really enjoyed it. And Jim got better and came back. And he said, can I take you out to lunch his first day back? And I said, sure. We went to a restaurant, kind of his hangout, I think. And we sat down, and he said, don't take this personally, but I work alone. I'm going to do everything in my power to get rid of you.
Wow.
And I know. And so I kind of.
At least he paid for lunch.
He did pay for lunch, but I kind of decided I'm going to handle this the way my dad would. My dad was head of a huge corporation, and he was always very calm. And I just said, well, I'm going to really help as a producer. I think I'm pretty good at booking guests, and I have a feel for things people would like to see on the air. And so, I'll be right there beside you, and I hope I can change your mind. And I did.
Yeah.
And I did it by saving him several times. And of course, he would save me too. And we just developed this wonderful friendship. And right up until he died, we were in touch, and we would laugh a lot, and he was very affectionate. And I was too old to be his daughter, but he and I just had that kind of relationship, and he was fun to work with. Sometimes he was a challenge because he didn't like to do the research. Well, really, it was fine because I'm a compulsive researcher, that 62-page radio proposal.
Right.
So I would be up all night reading 350 pages of Nutrition and You to interview the author the next morning, and he'd walk in and go, who's on today?
Mm-hmm. And you know what? That's okay. If that's the way that you handle those things, his off the cuff and sometimes maybe uninformed questions might have been the best question of the interview. He
was so funny. And he was on the air exactly as he was off the air. Always funny, always approachable, sometimes a little irascible, but always with humor. I loved that job. I called it play for pay.
Yeah, I did. I did it for a little more than a year and a half with Helen. It's the reason I changed stations. And it was the best thing that I did over 31 years. Not that anything else wasn't good, but to host a show with a live audience. So you've got to keep them entertained too, which is, that's a skill. To do 6 different interviews on different topics in an hour, and be informed and funny and entertaining and get along with a co-host. That was the greatest challenge that I ever had. And it was the greatest joy that I ever had to do that show.
Well, the thing about you, Carl, is that you are so funny yourself. You come from a comedic background. Weren't you a stand-up comic? You were.
I have done stand-up comedy, and I'm doing it again now.
Oh, that's great. Good. And also you have what Jim had, and that is the ability to be yourself on the air. And that's so important. There's no persona. You are who you are, and people can sense that, I really think.
Well, thank you. Which I think that show gives somebody the opportunity to do that. I mean, that's why Dave Anderson, who followed me, was so good at it. I just, KATU made a change. They took the studio audience out for most of the days. It was an insurance issue. They took it out of the news department. That, you know, they have some segments that are paid for by sponsors. So the news co-host job could not coexist, and so that's why the change happened. And I understood that. It was fine. I just am so glad that having been a fan of you and Jim, to get to do that with Helen is one of my greatest memories of all the years that I was in TV there in Portland.
And you know, one of the joys of my life is that Helen, who hosts AM Northwest, is one of my dearest friends.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah,
started just like you did. She got her foot in the door in Seattle. She was a secretary. She was an audience coordinator and worked her tail off.
Yep.
And I'm so proud of her and you know, for starting at the bottom and getting to the top.
But I always wanted to be a writer for a newspaper. Always.
Now that's interesting, really.
Always wanted to. It started when you don't need this much detail, but I think this is funny. My mom had 5 kids in 5 years. I was the oldest. When I was 6 years old, we all got chicken pox. And my dad had a job where he traveled all the time, and my mom lost her mind. My dad got home from his business trip. I'll never forget this. He had this huge box. It was a television set. I had never seen a television set before. And so this must have been 58 or 9 or something like that. And so he unpacked it and he plugged it in, and I was spellbound, and I watched it like for an hour. And then this actually happened. I left the living room, walked down the hall to the bathroom, closed the door, locked the door, looked in the mirror, picked up the soap, and did a commercial. And I remember thinking, I could do this. I could do this.
Awesome.
But in second grade, we moved 18 times, as I said. In second grade, the second place we lived was Indianapolis, and I started a newspaper. And my teacher would, what was that called? That process where they copied things and it smelled good?
Mimeograph. Or
my teacher would mimeograph it for the whole school. And it's because I was watching Superman.
And you wanted to be Lois Lane.
Lois Lane was the only woman on TV who had the exact same job as a man. Think about it. Clark was a reporter, she was a reporter. And yes, Superman was always rescuing her, but Superman was rescuing Jimmy Olsen too, so come on.
Yeah. Hey, I did the newspaper thing too. I started a newspaper at my little league when I was about 13 years old. You know, standings and reports on games, because I wanted to be a sports reporter. And my dad played along because so he was a teacher. So he would help me type out the stories, and we would mimeograph them off. And the next day I would go around and hand them out to everybody at the Little League games. That was my journalistic start.
All right, Carl. I love that. You went on to do sports.
Yeah, for many years. Yeah, before I shifted over to news.
I always had wanted to write. And what happened at Channel 2 is that without using any names or anything, the station suddenly acquired Oprah for what I understood was quite a large amount of money, because actually I knew the wife of the salesman for King Syndicate, who said, I think you're paying more than New York. And drinks might have been involved, but I don't know. That was just a rumor. So suddenly I was hosting 2 at 4 in the afternoon.
Well, let's start there. They brought in that afternoon show, and you went to that. Mary Starrett went to the morning.
No, actually, I did both shows.
Oh,
for
really?
about
Okay.
18 months. They wanted to use me again, and so I was doing 2 shows a day. And then Faces and Places was an evening magazine show that had terrible ratings, and they had to cancel it. But the station manager wanted Mary Starrett to stay on the air, so they put her on. They put her on the morning show, and I went to them and said, look, I'm a single mom now. I'd been recently divorced. My daughter gets out of school at 3. I'd rather stay with the morning show with Jim, which I've done for so long and which I produced and I'm invested in. And they said, no, you know, anyway.
Yeah, it worked out.
Show. I went to the afternoon show. Promises were made, promises were broken. And suddenly they had the Oprah show and no place to put it. So even though our show was leading in the ratings and they were making money on it, our show was canceled. And I was transferred to the news department, where my new boss, my new news director, said, you know, you should do what, and he named a former woman anchor at Channel 2, what she did. You should find a rich husband and just stay home. And I thought, oh, I'm not going to climb this mountain all over again.
I'm just making a list of the things I'm going to apologize for when we get done, Margie, but you keep going.
Well, this guy. Anyway, so I had been contacted by Bill Hilliard of the Oregonian because he had seen me give a speech. And he said, "Are you interested in writing a gossip column for the Oregonian?" I said, "No, I'm a
Nah.
journalist and I'm a writer. I think I'm a pretty good writer. It's what I've always wanted to do." So I made a counteroffer. I said, "May I write 3 sample columns of the kind of column I would write for the Oregonian?"
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Yes." He said, "But also write me a gossip column." So I wrote one. I wrote one gossip column, and I wrote 3 general interest columns. One was a little investigative. I knew someone who was a detective on the force. Another was about a couple I had met on AM Northwest who both were mentally handicapped, and they fell in love with each other and had to persuade their families to let them get married. And now they want children. And that was an interesting situation.
Yeah.
Anyway, I remember what they were, but I submitted them and he said, "Okay, you're not going to be a gossip columnist. You're going to be a general interest columnist. And we're not going to put you in the living section just because you're a woman. You're going to be the first woman general interest columnist on the Metro pages." And so that's how I got the job. And
Hey, a guy that knew how to do things right, huh?
Bill Hilliard was so wonderful. He was a perfect gentleman to me. He was supportive, and my immediate editor, Judd Randall, when I joined, was also very supportive. And that was kind of necessary, and understandably, there was resistance to my being hired because I was one of those fluffy TV people who did household hints in the morning. How dare I come in and become a columnist, which is a coveted position in a newspaper.
Absolutely.
I totally understood. Some of them came around, usually the ones who sat around me and got to know me, and some of them never did. But I loved that job. I loved that job, and I miss it to this day.
Well, all of us in this business are writers in some way or another. And I can understand the joy of writing and writing something well and writing something that means something. Uh, there's nothing like it. I can compare the same thing to hosting a show in front of a live TV audience, nothing like that, and the joy from that. But I can understand where you're coming from. If you're a writer and to be given that opportunity with an audience that the Oregonian had, I understand the joy you have in that. It really, I wish more people could understand the value of that. I try to convince the kids that I teach every once in a while. I used to teach middle school, and now I substitute teach how valuable writing is. I don't know that they quite understand it because their only form of writing is like this.
Well, maybe they're becoming different kinds of storytellers, but it all comes down to telling stories, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to ask you a question. I hope you don't mind a conversation instead of a question.
Absolutely, that's what this is.
Yeah, but it's interesting to me how different types of media interviews work. Doing a live interview in front of a studio audience on a show like AM Northwest, which both you and I hosted, as opposed to doing a video interview where you are interviewing someone and it's being recorded, but it will be edited later.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to doing a print interview where the interview itself will never see the light of day. The interview is interpreted through your words when you write the column or the story. I mean, which do you prefer?
Prefer, that's an interesting question because they're all so different and so valuable. Um, yeah, I think I preferred most the live 5 or 6 minute interview with AM Northwest that needed a beginning, a middle, and end. It needed to tell a story. I mean, that needed to be done. That's a skill. That's a really tough skill to do. The TV interview, that's always interesting because as a reporter, I'm looking for a sound bite. Okay. I'm looking to ask you a question, and the answer you give me needs to be the right length, and it needs to tell what I needed to tell. And I'm not saying that as far as I want to tell a story, so tell me what I want to hear. I've learned what the story is. Help me tell it with this segment. And, the length of it can be something, but there's some limitations to that. So that's why oftentimes in TV news, I'm going to ask you that question a couple of times so that I know what you want to say and I know what you need to say. I need to get it in the right form. And so that's
Right.
that. and I've done some newspaper writing or articles, feature writing or freelance things. And I get what you're saying is most of the stuff you're getting is not going to go into a quotation. Some of it will, but into a quotation form. You're looking for background to help you find the words to tell the story right.
I think you're also looking for insight. And because the interview is private, I preferred to do them on the telephone because I discovered if I went to people's houses to interview them, they would try to clean the house and apologize for it when I got there. And I can't believe you're in my living room. But on the telephone, I would always say, go in a room where nobody can overhear you, close the door, and just talk to me. and I always try to be respectful. I said, you may end up telling me things that you don't feel comfortable including, and just tell me that. I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to help. And I love the sheer writing of my columns. And so if I had to pick my #1 job ever, it would definitely be working for the Oregonian, for Bill Hilliard. But I missed the spontaneity and the need to be aware simultaneously of 6 or 7 things on the air. And then, as you said, the need, and also the need to make the live interview compelling. If you have a guest who unfortunately simply just doesn't have much spark or speaks too slowly or doesn't have much to say, you have to find a way to keep that interview compelling. You can just hear the clicks. You know, nobody does this, and this is how old I am. They're changing the channel. No.
Get off the couch and walk up there and turn the channel.
But I remember one time we had a fellow on the air who just would not stop talking. I mean, so many funny, you and I should do another interview on the crazy funny things that happen on live TV. But, and we can entertain each other when we do. Have Helen come too. But anyway, he just would not stop talking, and it was time for a commercial break. And you know, they're like wrapping you up, and then they're like going to spot, which is, for those who don't know, what we call commercials in the biz. And then finally they're running their finger across their neck like cut, cut, cut. And this guy would not stop talking. So funny, I just kind of tapped his leg and he said live on the air, "Young woman, take your hand off my leg."
I had one of those with a guy, I can't remember his name, so I won't even say it, but he was kind of high up in Portland society and opinionated, and he was a guest every 4 or 5 months, and he was just going on and on and on about stuff, and we were running out of time. He didn't have to figure out, and I had to cut him off as politely, and thanks, we'll talk about that next time and move on, because we had other things to do, and he was so aghast, or at me specifically, God, Carl Click doesn't know what he's doing, and it was kind of, he was kind of marking his territory. He doesn't know who I am. Nobody cuts me off, and blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, I cut you off, but there's the producer in the air and the director and the floor director were all helping.
Yeah, we got to get to a Tide commercial, for God's sake.
We got to pay for this air that you're wasting.
Oh, man. I do want to say one thing, and that is I was on AM Northwest from 77 through 87, which was 11 years. And it was a very interesting period to do a live TV show in a small city like Portland. I mean, I'm not saying we're podunk, we're not. We're a major city, but still, compared to other cities, you wouldn't expect to get the biggest movie stars in the world on your show. And yet, because there was no such thing as a satellite interview yet, movie production companies and book publishers sent all the biggest best-selling writers, movie stars, TV stars around, physically sent them around the country on tours to do these morning shows. And I don't know if you knew this, but for a couple of years, we were the highest rated locally produced morning show in the country.
Doesn't surprise me.
It was something like a 56 share. And so, which meant over half of the people watching television were watching our show. And so everybody wanted to get on AM Northwest. We covered a lot of Oregon and Southern Washington. And so, I mean, Paul Newman, Robert Redford, every presidential candidate, and I mean the major ones that won and became president. All the Watergate figures who wrote books after the fact. It was just amazing. In fact, G. Gordon Liddy came on to promote his book, his autobiography, when I was pregnant with my daughter in 1980. And I had just read his book. Of course, I read the book.
Mhm.
Underlined questions in the margin, mispreparedness, and I was horrified by the things he said. The things about burning his hands with cigarettes and choosing his wife from military records because he was bad at math and he wanted his children to be good at math, and he didn't love her, but he wanted the math. So I read this book with horror, and the next morning he came on and we interviewed him, and he signed we always had the authors sign their books. And when after the show, I opened it and said, "Dear Margie, what a wonderful interview. I hope we will become good friends. Good luck with the baby. Love, Gordon." And I'm like, oh my God, Gordon Liddy. One of the things that was thrilling for me was that as a child, Mary Martin had been my idol. I wanted to be on Broadway and be a musical theater star. And she came through to do an interview. And I had mentioned to Lynn Bowler, our producer, that as a child, I had kept a scrapbook on Mary Martin. And so Lynn contacted my mother in LA, and my mother sent up the scrapbook unbeknownst to me. And when Mary Martin came on the show, I was shaking. I was so excited. And they brought out the scrapbook, and Mary was really touched and invited me to spend the day with her.
Oh, awesome.
So I took up in the limo, and we just developed a wonderful friendship. She lived in Palm Springs at the time. We stayed in touch. She collected hands, little statues of hands. And so I sent her a couple from local artists. And when I went into labor for my daughter, which was about 18 months after I met her, maybe 2 years, I think Lynn called her in Palm Springs and told her I was in labor. And she called the hospital and got put through somehow right after I had given birth, and congratulated me and said, "Hold the phone by the baby's ear." And she sang my daughter her first lullaby.
Oh my goodness, Margie, that's just
like
treasure.
That don't happen to regular people like me. Hey, did you ever feel like, I can't be on TV? People on TV are like people on Mars, like Walter Cronkite, or, I mean, I felt that way at first. I thought, oh God, I'd never be on the air. I'm not beautiful enough. You have to be Miss America and Albert Schweitzer to be on TV.
Evidently not. Look who's talking to you. And I did it for 31 years, Margie. So, you talked about those satellite interviews. I came in when I hosted the show about the time those were becoming the more preferred way to do those interviews, and understandably for the people. So we didn't have as many people come through, but I was excited as heck when I got to interview Jack Klugman in person. And Torty Orlando came through too. So.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, Jack Klugman's son lives in Portland.
Really?
Yeah.
That's why Jack Klugman was on our air. He was visiting his son, and he came through and he sat and talked with us. So, in fact, just yesterday we had the music station on. We were 70s, and Tony Orlando and Don came on. And I just turned to my wife and said, "I interviewed him in person once."
I interviewed Tom Jones on his private plane at the Portland airport.
Oh, wow.
I know. You look at me in a whole new way now, don't you, Claire?
That's not unusual.
The ones that I was most affected by were the ones that meant something to me from my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Like Jerry Mathers, who played Beaver on Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah.
Or the woman who played Kathy on Father Knows Best. And later, when I was doing radio as well as writing a column, Barbara Billingsley, who's the mother on Father Knows Best. In fact, I wrote a column about that. She said something I will never forget, and it made such an impression on me. She said, at a time when I was playing the prototypical perfect wife and mother and making every woman in America feel guilty because they weren't vacuuming in heels and pearls, she said, actually, I was leaving home at 7 a.m. and coming home at 7 p.m. I never saw my own children.
Wow.
That was reality.
Yeah.
Oh, and she told me the reason she always wore pearls is she had some weird bones here, and the producers wanted to cover them up, so she had to wear pearls in every episode. It was not a fashion statement.
No. So it was more than 20 years you were writing the column, right?
23 years.
Yeah. Were you ever, I was never really going to the station as a reporter worried about what story I was going to do, because there was always something. How often did that anxiety get you, as that I have a column due and I don't have it? Or was there just always this backlog of stories that you wanted to get to and were able to keep yourself busy?
There was never a backlog of stories. I had that anxiety every single day for 23 years, except when I
Wow.
was on vacation. Even my daughter, when I got the job, my daughter was 6 years old. She was in first grade. And I had to write three columns a week, which is a lot. I mean, other columnists around the country write 2 columns a week. I had to write 3. And for the first, I don't know, 18 years, I had no help whatsoever. I had no assistant. And the reader response was huge, huge. So a lot of my time was just coping with listening to 75 phone messages a day, to
Hoping a
try
story would come out, right?
yeah. And I was scrambling. I had no days off. All weekend long, I was looking for stories.
Mm-hmm.
I was driving my daughter to the bank one time, and down our U.S. Bank on Burnside, there were like a bunch of police cars and ambulances, and she turns to me, 6 years old, and she goes, "Mom, might be a column." There was terrible anxiety. And, sometimes people bring up columns I wrote about my daughter or memories of my family. The only time I ever wrote columns, personal columns, is if a column fell through at the last minute.
Right.
I never planned it. Also, even when she was 6 years old, I never wrote about my daughter unless she gave me permission.
Sure.
And sometimes she said no,
Oh.
and that was fine.
Mm-hmm.
But people still mention a column I wrote when I took her to college. She also went to Whitman College in Walla Walla. And driving home after dropping her off was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
I was a single mom, and we have a fantastic relationship, and we did all growing up. And it was just so hard knowing that I'm getting teary right now. She's too far away. She's in Washington, D.C. during quarantine. But it was just really hard. I had to pull over a couple times driving home. And I remember I went down to Zupan's. It was Kino's then. And I was just shopping for groceries. And I reached the dairy department, and I burst into tears because I realized I never have to buy milk again. But people mention that column a lot. And in fact, sometimes I just send a copy to people when their kids are leaving for college.
Sure. Yeah.
Did you have that when your kids left home?
Probably not on that level. Well, Jill and I, my wife and I, would take them together, and I can remember kind of feeling like I needed to be the support for Jill. We were both teary-eyed when we dropped both kids off, but I kind of felt like it was my job to put an arm around Jill and make sure that she was doing all right a little bit. Yeah, but I know what you're talking about. It's difficult, but it's so doggone necessary to send them off to that next stage. And luckily for us, both of them did really, really well. So I'm sure your daughter did as well.
Yeah, it's tricky when you're in the news business, knowing what to share, what and how much to share of your personal life with the public. But I think in the end, if you're willing to share a few key moments, and who did this so beautifully is Steve Dean.
Yeah.
Who is a brilliant writer. And he would share some stories from his life that were so touching. And it made the other stuff that he wrote, it makes the other stuff you write, I think, seem more vivid or more real to people because they feel they know you as a person.
Right. And as you were saying that, I agree with you about Steve Dean. I've known Steve forever, and he is brilliant. Is every other columnist that we know has done exactly what you said, is they have talked about their personal lives when it was right. Dave Barry, Mike Rocco, Irma Bombeck made a career out of it. And so, I mean, that is a necessary part, because you're writing about what you know is this, and to make sure that these people reading every column that you read know where you're coming from as a person, makes those other reading experiences more valuable to them, I imagine.
Right. But, it was rarely planned. It usually was because this guy I'm writing about today, and my deadline is at 3 o'clock, said he had proof of everything he claimed, and he was going to get all the documentation to me, and he didn't. So I'm not going to write his story. Oh my God, what
Yeah.
am I going to write about?
See, I mean, easy for me to say, I would have like 2 or 3 backup columns in a file, like just that I could, could pull out and and use for that emergency, because I can understand the anxiety of being able to hit that
Yeah,
deadline with
and
a
then you
column.
use up those backup columns, and then you're right back where you started from.
Exactly. Do
Let's be
you,
realistic.
yeah, do you remember the column you wrote about me?
No, I'm sorry. Remind me.
No, I'm happy that you did not. Do you not remember? When I was starting up stand-up comedy,
No, wait,
uh,
was it the time you got arrested? No,
no,
I'm
I
kidding.
didn't know. Not that time, not that column. Starting up, doing stand-up comedy just as a hobby with a couple other friends. One guy was a producer at Channel 6, who has gone on to be a television producer. One guy was a photographer who's still working in the market, and one guy was a magician. We were young, and so in order to get audiences, we would just invite our friends to some place, and we tell the tavern owner, hey, listen, we're going to bring 30 people in here. Can we have your stage and do our stand-up routines? So we did that a few times, and I invited you to come to one. And you couldn't come to that one, but you did say, do you have any others? And unfortunately, we did, and it was out at the Clark County Fair at an outdoor restaurant pizza place outside the fair. And of course, you couldn't come to the one where all our friends were there drinking and laughing, but you came to this one, and
Oh,
all of us bombed. All
oh,
4 of us
I'm
bombed
sorry.
badly.
Did
Um,
you say you bombed?
uh,
I
uh,
can't believe I would do that.
Well, I think you talked about the lessons that comedy teaches young people.
Carl.
uh, but the reason we bombed was, and I've learned this in doing comedy, is there are lots of reasons you bomb, but in lots of cases, it's just the venue, it's the atmosphere. People didn't come to sit down to listen to comedy; they came to have pizza, and there's a guy talking to them about X, Y, and Z, and the microphone's not good, and the ambience isn't right, and so the same material we'd done the night before with 40 people that we knew that were having a good time and came to see comedy didn't land the way it did
Yeah.
outside the Clark County Fair at a pizza place. So you did write about that and about how we learned a good lesson.
Oh, I'm sorry that I couldn't go to the original one. I do have to tell you that as a singer, I'm very familiar with performing in the wrong venue at the wrong time for the wrong people. So I am many times I performed with local jazz groups or with Tom Grant or supremely talented people, and no one's paying attention, and they're missing out on some of the best music they could ever want to hear. And so, and I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the people I was performing with.
Yeah.
So I really do understand that. However, since you mentioned the Clark County Fair, I have a very fond memory for an experience I had there. Um, when I first came to Portland, I continued singing jingles at Portland recording studios for advertising agencies. And there was a receptionist at one of them, and she was super nice, and we became friends. And one day she called me up at Channel 2 and she said, we just got one of these Bouvier de Flandre dogs, a French dog, and we're naming her, with your permission, Margie Boule. And I said, well, that's so sweet. Of course, how wonderful. So I kind of forgot about it. Once in a while, when I went in to sing or something, we would talk about the dog, Margie Boule. And she always called her Margie Boule. She never called her Margie. So anyway, she calls me up one day and she goes, we've been taking her to dog shows and she's been winning everything. And we think she might become a grand champion this weekend at the Clark County Fairgrounds. Would you like to come watch the dog show? And, I hear my little daughter's voice, might be a column.
My thing.
Constantly looking. So I drove up there. I remember I got the first speeding ticket of my life as I was driving up to the Clark County Fairgrounds. And so I pull in and I walk inside, thousands of people, and I finally see them waving, and I come over and my friend says, this is Margie Boule. And I said, yeah, I know. And she goes, no, I'm talking to the dog. And it happened all day long. It happened like that. She would say, Margie, don't sit, you'll get dirty. And I would stand up. But she did really well. And finally she advanced, and finally it was all the female dogs in competition. And I was we were watching, and what do you know, she won. And over the loudspeaker at the Clark County Fairgrounds, they go, "Best bitch, Margie Boule." And they even pronounced my name right.
Oh my goodness, you had a headline right
Oh
there.
my gosh. There was just one thing I was concerned about. And I said, you don't let her run free in the neighborhood, do you? And she said, "Oh no." And I said, "Thank God, because I don't want the neighbors saying, 'Oh, Margie Boule pooped in our yard again.'"
Oh, yeah, but all that just makes the greatest column ever.
It was a fun column to write.
Yeah. Oh, Margie, I can't thank you enough for spending a little bit of your day with me. And I mean, I know for a fact that this just is part one. We're going to come back and do this again. And I love your idea of having Helen join us.
I have at least an hour of stories of the horrible things that happen on live TV. And I know you do, and Helen does too. So we should make it a threesome sometime.
We will do that. So Margie, I just really love the fact that you're still a Portland treasure, and the fact that you would take some time to chat with us here is just awesome. And I hope all the best for you and your daughter out there on the other side of the country. I hope you guys get together soon when we get this pandemic taken care of.
And the same to you and your family, Carl. I really, let's get through all of this and have regular life come back. We're all hungry for that.
Absolutely.